Good afternoon. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. My colleague Sushma, Raman, and I welcome you, our audience, and also our three distinguished speakers to today's conversation as part of our Fierce Urgency of Now series, which is a series in which we have already covered a broad range of concerns, all at the intersection of economic and racial justice since the beginning of the semester. The title of our series is taken from Martin Luther King Jr., whose work was itself the subject of one of our sessions just a couple of weeks ago. And all of these, of course, have been recorded, so you can find them, you can easily find them online. The subject of today's webinar is surveillance capitalism, a term coined and brought into circulation by Shoshana Zuboff, whose 2019 book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power, struck a nerve with millions of people around the world. If you are like me, at least in some relevant ways, then you are accompanied by your electronic devices all day long. They are the first thing you touch in the morning, and they are the last thing you put aside at night. And if you sleep poorly, you even touch them at some point during the night, with many interactions and encounters with electronic devices in between. All these activities generate data collected by the providers of the platforms or whatever software is involved in the networking. Once myriads upon myriads of such data are collected, those who have control over them can use them to predict or manipulate what each of us will do or say next, based on what many others who are importantly like us have done or said next. The economic relevance of such surveillance has become so dramatic that the term surveillance capitalism has become utterly appropriate to characterize this whole period of capitalism. According to Karl Marx, whose ongoing relevance also was the subject of an earlier webinar in this series, one of the pathologies of capitalism is that it increasingly commodifies components of our reality, in the sense that they get a price ticket and are tradable on markets, and are then increasingly less valued in all other ways, except that they have that price that makes them tradable on markets. In surveillance capitalism, commodification has become so extreme that it would be a massive understatement to say our data are commodified. Instead, what is being commodified is our lived reality overall, to the extent that it is constantly accompanied by data collecting devices. One glance at all this is that liberal democracies are formulating a peculiar response here to the way China has brought its governance systems into the digital age. Some years ago, many people thought the Communist Party in China was coming to the end of its rule because of the rise of the Chinese middle class. But that is decidedly not what has happened. Instead, the Communist Party in China adopted technology, including the widely discussed electronic social scoring system, to tighten its grip. And now China is one of the very few economies in the world on track to finish the year 2020, this bizarre year 2020, stronger than where it was in January economically, while also crushing all opposition and dissent, both the Uyghurs and, of course, also what's been happening in Hong Kong in these recent months. Liberal democracies, too, need to move into the digital age, but so far it seems the biggest step that they have done in that they have taken in that regard is to adopt surveillance capitalism. But where does this all leave the global South? And that is really our topic for today. Our conversation is with three experts working in and on technology by centering the perspectives of the global South. And it is a truly global conversation that we are having today. So our first speaker is going to be Chinmay Arun, who has taught at two highly regarded law schools in India and was the founding director of the Center for Communications Governance at the National Law University in Delhi. And her work focuses on the impact of AI and algorithms on human rights in the global South. Sabelo Mlambi is the founder of Bantocracy, which focuses on Ubuntu ethics and technology, and he's a technology and human rights fellow at the Carr Center, where he has made all of us think much harder than we have ever done before about Ubuntu ethics and its relevance for technology. His work focuses on African perspectives in AI policy, including non-Western frameworks to examine the impact of automated decision-making. And then our third speaker is Joana Barón, who is the Executive Directress of Coding Rights in Brazil and also a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Carr Center. Her work sits at the intersection of art, activism, and technology, and her focus is on bringing Latin American perspectives in the search of feminist techno-political frameworks for human rights-based development, deployment, and usages of technology. Thank you to the three of you for joining us today. So I'm going to ask each of our guests now to start with brief opening remarks that center Global South innovations in response to technological harms, including work that they have spearheaded, and we will go into the order in which I introduce them. So Chinmayi will go first, then Sabelo will take over, and then Joana will take over. And once our three speakers have made the opening remarks, Sushma will join the conversation and will start the actual discussion. And all of you who are joining us on YouTube, please do put your questions in the YouTube channel. We will be monitoring that, and your questions will be entering into this conversation in that way as well. And with all that said, without further ado, Chinmayi, over to you.
Thank you, Mathias. And thank you all of you for having me be a part of this session. It's always such a great pleasure to share any space with Sabelo and Joana, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with all of you. I only wish that we could have had it in person. And so I'm going to begin a little provocatively with a documentary that perhaps many of you have seen. It's called The Social Dilemma. It's on Netflix, and it's raised some of the questions of surveillance capitalism that Mathias just outlined usefully for us. And if you watched it, you might have been struck by the number of Caucasian men that were leading the conversation on what's wrong with surveillance capitalism. And I highlight this to you because I think that part of the problem with this debate is that it focuses only on one corner of what's going on and misses quite a lot of nuance as a result of doing that. You'll see that a lot of literature that you read on AI, which is much more informed, also suffers from this problem, where we're always examining just this one corner. And we talk about issues as if they're distinct from each other, as if surveillance capitalism affects only consumers in particular countries, and as if it has no connection with what these companies do in other parts of the world. But that's actually not how these systems work. And that's really the question that I started exploring in this book chapter that I wrote on AI and the Global South for the Oxford Handbook of Ethics of AI. And I'm going to draw on that chapter in what I say, just in case you want to read parts of it. My premise in thinking about this question is really that we're all connected. And AI affects the lives of people in more ways than you see immediately. When you look purely at the surveillance capitalism in the West lens. And so, for example, one of the greatest impacts of AI comes from public-private partnerships that permeate everything from state surveillance and immigration to the distribution of food. If you take what's happening in the countries that you might be familiar with, and I actually don't want to assume that all of you come from the West, you might consider what happens when these same systems are deployed in countries with weaker rule of law, with poorer enforcement mechanisms for human rights, with regulators that don't do as much as, say, a regulator in Europe might do about data protection. And if you think about what happens when these systems pilot particular things like automatic face tagging, that's something that Facebook started, and they weren't able to run it in Europe, but they were able to try it out in other parts of the world. You could also think a little bit about the narratives that are built around it. I come from India, which is famously the country that pushed back on Facebook's free basics, which was sold as a way to get all the marginalized people of the Southern world online. Now that we read Shoshana Zuboff's work on surveillance capitalism, we can see that bringing multiple people online is basically shorthand for more data for the surveillance capitalists. But when my colleagues and I, who were impressing upon the regulator that this is not something we want to allow in India, when we were making these arguments, we were told that, well, it's internet for the people and the people need to get online. And we were actually able to push them back, pointing out that that this is text-based internet. And if you're talking about the marginalized people of India, they don't read. And so it's not really of much use to them. And then there were, of course, other arguments about diversity of information. But the fact that what was happening was that they were all sort of fodder being gathered for the surveillance capitalists is something that was entirely missed, because the theorists of the West were not looking at the South. And it was with some difficulty that the Southern theorists were able to push these systems back. Now, these systems were the reason that the surveillance capitalist companies ended up in countries like Myanmar, where they hadn't conducted human rights impact assessments, and ended up, contributing to genocide, which is enormous. But it was again, by taking one particular model and using it in a context in which they didn't fully understand what their algorithms combined with that society would do. But it's not, I don't want to pick only on surveillance capitalist companies from the North operating in the South, because it's a little more complicated than that. So I'm going to conclude by giving you 4 different ways in which these systems work. One is this traditional understanding of the American companies effectively operating in the rest of the world. But there's more. There's also Southern companies. So India, for example, has its biometric identification system, which is also a very capitalist system being pushed quite heavily by the Indian government. And that again brings aboard a lot of people, and it does so by linking to public distribution systems like the right to food, which leaves a lot of marginalized people with no choice but to be a part of this system and then have their human rights systematically violated. And it's a system that's being exported really to other parts of the Southern world. You'll also see that that some of the Chinese companies are also now beginning to operate in other Southern countries where the political elite are happy to join hands with a capitalist company to conduct surveillance on the population. And so there's that kind of exploitation that also happens in the South through models of surveillance capitalism that combine in a bad way with the worst of the institutional weakness of the global South. And the last is really a category that even surprised me as I was reading, which is that there are vulnerable people within what we consider strong Western democracies, like refugees with people with limited rights. And they again are subject to violation of their rights through surveillance capitalist systems. When they enter, they have to give up data. There are algorithms used to assess how their rights will be granted to them. And they are also a huge population that we need to take into account when we're talking about how human rights and surveillance capitalism interact in this changing world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chinmay, for that wonderful introduction. I think the African continent also shares some strong similarities with what you've been describing happening in India. One particular difference is that in sub-Saharan Africa, we essentially lost the battle against the free Facebooks, the free internets, and so forth. Whereas in India, there was a different level of success. But it's, I think what brings us all here together is that we realize that there's something fundamentally wrong, right, with this model that we call surveillance capitalism. And I wonder what exactly makes it wrong? What makes it dangerous? Is it that it's surveillance, or is it that it's capitalistic? Or maybe is it like both of those combined? In other words, could we have technology that did not surveil, but was still commodifying our humanity, commodifying our labor? Would that still be problematic, right? Would we still be having these conversations today? Undoubtedly, we know that there is a problem with the current model that is dominating how we access the internet and how we even facilitate our online relationships. And I'd like to draw upon the Ghanaian Adinkra symbol of Sankofa, which suggests that when we are lost, when we find that we have lost a sense of ourselves, when we find that we have lost our well-being, our human dignity, our human worth, then we need to go back and retrace our steps and find exactly where we might have went wrong and where we might have lost that sense of who we are. And surveillance capitalism enables that loss of self, the loss of healthy identities, the loss of human dignity, the loss of human worth. And this is facilitated definitely because of the commodification and the dispossession that comes with surveillance capitalism. And if we're to sort of go back now and trace where we got lost, right, and to retrace how we can, where we made the mistakes that have put us where we are today, I can't help but, go back to and link this to the historical colonialism and the historical capitalistic processes. These are processes that definitely have given the foundation and the groundwork of the surveillance capitalism that we do have today. These are processes that were essentially built on violence, physical violence, sexual violence, cultural violence, religious violence. And this violence was meant to enforce and meant to impose or even redefine what personhood was globally. Who counts as a person? Who matters as a person? Who deserves protection as a person? And what is the nature of society's relationship to the individual? And what is the individual's relationship or obligations to society and to the environment? Now, through this legacy of violence and frankly, ongoing violence, it was precisely designed in order to centralize power into the hands and into the minds and voices of certain European and American actors. So just like these historical processes, surveillance capitalism also is a form of violence. It is a form of oppression. It doesn't require our consent. It's pushed onto us. It leverages market powers. It leverages the economies of scale, and it's disproportionately imposed on the global south. And if we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, the ability to effectively resist becomes increasingly diminished when you look at the other interconnected inequalities and power symmetries that already exist. Just as you mentioned, Chinmaya, about how this is all interconnected, right? When we're looking at the high cost of the internet in the African continent and other inequalities that relate to infrastructure, data privacy laws, and so forth, it becomes harder to effectively resist or to effectively consent to some of these tools that are enabled by surveillance capitalism. So my work right now at this moment and where I am in my thinking, and as I've studied the impact of this in the global south, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is to then start thinking, well, what are the appropriate forms of regaining our power, of retaking power? Because if we're unable to sort of find effective power and be able to use that power, we may find that we will be still having the same conversations, years and years from now. Maybe they would have changed to different topics, but the themes would still be the same. And my first suggestion is that perhaps we can start thinking about reclaiming power and redistributing power, democratizing power, but first considering the connection of power and the mind, right? How we think about power, how we think about who we are as people, how we think about what is the relationship we should be having with each other, how should technology relate to us, and in that context begin to center humans as opposed to what we find with the imposition of surveillance capitalism, that we tend to focus on optimization, efficiency, human productivity, whereas we now begin to live out human dignity, human worth, and human well-being. And in closing, I would say this is why I have sort of gravitated towards the Ubuntu philosophy, because it's strongly based on the idea of human dignity, human worth, and human well-being. And perhaps we could find some considerations within that framework that can allow us to better frame the problems we're facing, and to also allow us to start thinking about tools we can use effectively to challenge this ongoing episode of violence that is now digital.
Thank you, Sabelo. Always so philosophical and inspiring, and I think our talks will connect well. I will share with you my screen because I have some visuals, and can you see it? Does it work well? Yeah, okay. So my talk, I'm going to talk about surveillance capitalism, but gendered surveillance capitalism. because also when you have, I believe that when you have a gender lenses to some phenomena also in the internet, you can capture some trends of oppression even before that happened with misinformation. We women were already suffering misinformation, online attacks, dealing with incel logics even before misinformation or fake news was a topic. So I'll bring you some feminist and gender perspectives of surveillance capitalism. Women and gender non-conforming people in its intersectionalities of race, sex, class, have been starkly under scrutiny of conservative eyes, afraid of changes in the status quo of an ongoing patriarchal heteronormative power dynamics. As Nicole Sheffer notes in her article entitled Big Data and Sexual Surveillance, she said, surveillance has historically functioned as an oppressive tool to control women's bodies and is closely related to colonial modes of managing populations. So we can say that from witch hunting times to a world with high hopes for artificial intelligence, you can observe that gender surveillance have been performed under excuses such as population control, public health, morality, normativity, even aesthetics, and marketing purposes. So it's a bit different than what we see in terms of actors, rationales of just surveillance. And as it was mentioned very well by both my colleagues, all the surveillance systems and surveillance capitalism is meant to reinforce this, what Patricia Hill Collins named the matrix of domination of heteropatriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism. And this massive capacity and this trend, historical trend of surveillance, particularly towards women and gender non-conforming people, gets more complex with this massive capacity of data processing that we are experiencing today in the digital age. To show this and to translate this trend to a bigger audience and not exactly only focused on human rights, that Coding Rights a few years ago, also inspired by Sushma's thoughts. It was even before the book, but she had already coined the term. We did this platform, Chupadados, the hidden faces of our beloved technologies. Chupadados can be translated as the data sucker and inspired by a mythology from Latin America, chupacabras. So this is the chupadados. And in some narratives in their histories, in there we show how our data bodies are being used to manipulate and impose gender normativity. So as Mathias was mentioning, we love our tech devices, but in the chupadados, we point out that there is this assumption that perhaps we are engaging in an abusive relationship with those devices that we love so much because they are pertained by this logic of the chupadados, the data sucker, or the logic of surveillance capitalism. So, and this is in our interactions more and more in our interactions with our cities, with our homes, with our pockets, with our bodies. So for instance, one article that we did in the Chupadados platform was about period trackers, in which we analyzed a high amount of data sets that's being put into those kinds of apps, information about our body, about our emotions, offline behavior, just to have back to two kinds of data, two kinds of information. When is our period and when was our period and when is our fertile moment. but all this data is being used for other purpose, of course. So there was this study from Privacy International published at The Guardian showing that some of those women's fertility apps were being funded by anti-abortion campaigners and being used as a tool to harm access to sexual and reproductive rights. Another example that we bring is about ads. And this is another article by Achupadados, but just yesterday, we were, me and my partner were looking at her Instagram, and a bunch of babies started to pop in her feed. And we were not looking for babies and anything, but I don't know, Instagram thought that it was important to show babies. And this was already mapped, and it was like endless feed of babies. And this kind of ads or feeds were already portrayed in this article in Chupadados, in which we saw that even though the ads don't look like this anymore, very gender normative, in which women are taking care of the home, they look more like this, kind of visually neutral, but if the algorithm is showing those ads just to women, ads about babies, about fertility doctors, this means that the gender roles are being reinforced by the algorithm showing those ads. I'll jump out of this. So one issue that I think is in the core of the debate of surveillance capitalism and those platforms is that consent is being taken in data protection regulations as a core concept, but it's very weak. In this article, me and my colleague Paz Peña, we listed the qualifiers of consent in the feminist debates of consent to our bodies, and we listed the qualifiers of consent in data protection legislation, such as the GDPR and the Brazilian data protection legislations. And we see that the qualifiers in the feminist theories, the list is much longer, but even more complicated. All those qualifiers, all those requirements are released just by the click of an agree button, in which no one has even read to the terms. And you cannot just don't agree. If you don't agree, if you disagree, you will be digitally excluded. So you are deprived of no in those senses. And as Sarah Ahmed said, if you are deprived of no, you cannot consent. So if we take this to the scenario in which we are discussing AI systems, in which the world is seeing or pointing or selling the idea that data is going to be the problem solver, consent on AI systems is even more remote than the consent that we give to those online platforms that we were talking before. In this project, which is about to be launched, me and my colleague Paz Peña, we are mapping AI systems in Latin America by the public sector that might have bias or discriminations in terms of gender and in its intersectionalities. And one of the examples was this case of an AI to predict teenage pregnancy in the municipality of Salta in Argentina. For that project, the governor of Salta said, with technology based on name, surname, and address, you can predict 5 or 6 years ahead which girl, future teenager, is 86% predestined to have a teenage pregnancy. So the teenagers become predestined by an AI system. Of course, there were a lot of criticism about the system. mostly because the risk of poor women and children sensitive data being used by the system, problems of bias because the data set doesn't take into account that reporting of unwanted pregnancy and the data about that is mostly inadequate there. And so all sorts of criticism, but this project is being exported and it's a partnership with Microsoft in Argentina is being exported to Brazil. So with those systems, we have this problem, which is we have an abstract representation of a problem that we universalize, we simplify a very complex reality under the judgment of the creators of those systems. And in Brazil, the creators of those systems, or at least will be managing the implementation of that particular pilot on children, teenager pregnancy, is the Ministry of Women and Family, who said that boys were blue and girls were pink, and that's how she will handle her ministry. So there is the moral thermometer of those systems will be framed by those in power. Also the Brazilian government now that has this war against what they call gender ideology, and it's being imported. Just to wrap, another thing that's happening is in Brazil, last year we had 2 decrees that are making it easy for the public sector to share data among different databases from the government. I think, Shema, it's very inspired also by Aadhaar, because our CPF will be the unifier of that. And this, those decrees even allow for sharing of very sensitive data like biometric data. So we are talking about surveillance capitalism from those big platforms in our relations with the devices, but we are also more and more beyond the devices, beyond the screens. Our bodies are becoming data sources from facial recognition, but also DNA. In this database in Brazil, they talk about DNA as well. So it's that would be, I think that would be even a more complex way, like how do you consent to your face being recognized in the streets? We don't have the agree button anymore. Your DNA can be discovered if someone else from your family does a DNA ancestry test. So this is going to be even more complex, and the term of consent is going to be even less useful. To deal with all that, in coding rights, we are, and in parallel, we have this, we have a lot of data about very important things that are happening, and those data are being ignored. We have data about the Amazon burning, we have data about our wetlands being dismantled by fire. So this was an article that also published with Camila Nóbrega, in which we were questioning why there is this, in one hand, all those data that we have is just being ignored, and then in the other hand, data that will be used to control people, to impose the metrics of domination and capitalist values are, the people are doing those mega databases to compile and to cross those data. So yes, to wrap, what I'm trying to do with also my partner on research, Paz Peña, and Sasha Constanza from the MIT, is to envision other futures, to bring feminist values, to think about beyond consent, what values we need to have embedded in technologies. So instead of maintaining the metrics of domination, we can question that. So this is it's a game, it's an artistic project that we play to envision, we call it Oracle for Transfeminist Futures, and we use it to envision feminist technologies. But now I'm in the process of beyond playing the game and using our imagination, try to build a framework, a transfeminist framework to question those systems and to envision other systems. And that's it. Thank you. Let me see. Stop share. Okay.
Thank you all so much for your very, very thoughtful and very wise remarks. So we have a few questions from the audience, but I'll start with one that's on our minds, which is around the role of civil society in each of these countries, because the reality is that civil society in the global south is quite vibrant and has been very, very innovative in trying to hold government to account. So how can civil society best hold governments and technology companies accountable and ensure sort of freedom of speech and expression, but also ensure the right to privacy, freedom from being surveilled? Are there best practices that you can lift up or share for us? And I'll also flag a question from the audience on this front, which is that what happens to civil society advocacy when it's being co-opted by funding from big tech? So Joanna, you're laughing at this question, so maybe I'll start with you first.
It's such an important question because we see, Google and Facebook do invest a lot on civil society organizations and digital rights, and it's very like we don't get money from big tech, but that was offered. I think it's offered to every civil society working in the field, and they were very clever to coin the narrative that they fight for digital freedom, internet freedom. And that was also a terminology from the US government in diplomatic arenas. No, we are fighting for internet freedom. But they were fighting actually for those companies to expand their businesses, which has nothing to do with freedom. It has to do with monopolies, with surveillance, and content moderation according to a particular logic. So for me, it's an excellent question, very problematic, and I think civil society should have a more open conversation about this. It's a hard conversation to have. Of course, people need to want to keep doing their work, but I see that the Silicon Valley tech companies have a narrative of rights that is dismantling recently. But it was very obvious since the beginning that it wasn't about rights, it's about businesses. Mm-hmm.
So are there examples or models of civil society advocacy in the space that you can lift up?
I can share a perspective on that. I think the central issue in sub-Saharan Africa is that, and truthfully, we see this in many arenas besides technology, whether it's how to run the economy, how to run the nation, how government should be like, is like taking Western policies as they are, and then trying to apply them in the African continent, right? And one of the reasons we can probably come up with why the big tech companies succeeded Twitter has free internet in South Africa at one point, Google, Facebook, and why they succeeded, I would imagine is that, because one, they do receive support from big tech companies, the civil society organizations, they they slightly debated the issue of, this paraded internet, but they still chose to go ahead with it. And so there's a conflict there when your main funding is purely Western, when the Western donors are funding causes that align with, their principles. Maybe it's, individual rights, or maybe it's anti-privacy, anti-surveillance. And not to suggest that these issues are not worthy of consideration, but when we're as a continent are just taking these principles and values and just applying them, then we end up with the situations that can disadvantage us in the global south, because we're doing this mostly essentially, for the aid. And there's been work that's been written on, the issue of aid in the African continent and so forth, and that even in some cases, even refusing to sort of trying to better regulate big tech, or US big tech rather, could be an affront to, to the United States, where now you might be risking receiving other aid in other arenas and in other domains. So civil society should play a role in definitely pushing back, but it's such hard to do so when, the core of your funding is tied to, foreign entities, and also when if you try to regulate such companies, then you might also be alienating yourself from, other from the dominant economies in the world, and not only just for the United States or for Europe, but we can also, see probably that same scenario with the Chinese government and its incursion into the African economy, where now big AI contracts in Zimbabwe are being given to the Chinese government in order to bring on, surveillance systems, right? And then one can just quickly see those connections there. If we're looking at the case of human rights, and also, looking at the inability for African nations, for sub-Saharan African nations, to effectively, resist, whether it's Eastern policies or whether it's Western policies, just not having the resources or the ability to effectively resist, and that's a challenge that we're facing.
Chinwe, I'll ask you to weigh in on this question, but also if you have any reflections after hearing Joanna and Sabelo in response or in addition to that, it would be great to hear your thoughts.
Very much so. It's been so helpful to hear both your presentations and your takes on this specific question. I ran an organization that was dedicated to working out ways to protect constitutional rights in this era of big tech. But we were not civil society. The specific gap that we were trying to fill was actually a lack of thinking about how to do this. And so with net neutrality, for example, we had nothing to do with the campaign and everything to do with the specific argument of why the law needs to be the way it is, given the state of the Indian Constitution. And I think that in part, one of the ways in which it would help to think about the South is if donors and funders and everybody else separated out activism from theorizing and from scholarship, because they're both necessary if we want to come up with solutions that are useful for the South. So I think in part the reason that these sort of models are being adapted from the West, to give you an example, when net neutrality started, there was a lot of talk in India about common carriage as an argument. But common carriage is a principle that's very specific to American law and doesn't apply to Indian telecommunication law. So you need someone to do the work of figuring out which principle within Indian law would achieve the purpose of creating net neutrality. And you won't get it from American papers if that's all that people are reading. So I think that there's a serious ecosystem problem that we need to solve. But that said, I do think that the question of how big tech affects civil society is significant, especially because in the global South, there's limited access to foundation funding. And so a lot of the organizations that are looking especially for core funding are really in a corner about how to survive and sustain themselves. And so in part, they access the money. I'm not justifying it, especially if the funds influence the way in which they work, but it is something that we also need to work on at a structural level Two is that when the foundations do fund, the amount of funds that they have access to, the way in which they can use those funds, that can be restricted sometimes. But you'll also see that a lot of the great pushback to companies tends to come from foundation funding. But I'm a little hesitant about going too far down this road, because sometimes what happens is that, say, a free speech argument that the companies are very happy to sponsor in their self-interests also happens to align with the population's interests. And then the fact that the civil society has received foreign funding to make that argument is used to undermine them. And there the question to ask is also, who is benefiting from the protection of these rights? Is it purely big tech? Is it also other people? But also, what are the ways in which big tech is skewing the debate? So there was a whole period, for example, in which there was a lot of funding being given for internet shutdowns, which of course big tech didn't want. But it was much harder to get funding for questions of equality, questions of privacy, which especially, now there's funding available, but in the early days, big tech was very anti any discussion of privacy in the global South. And so the agenda setting can be affected by big tech, not even necessarily by actually funding civil society, but by basically funding all of the spaces in which conversations happen. So if you don't work on shutdowns, or you don't work on whatever it is that big tech has made the big issue of the day, you're not, your work isn't relevant to what's going on. But I want to flag one more thing, especially given, what Sabelo was saying about the way in which technology is being deployed in Zimbabwe, and, what Joanna and I were saying earlier about our local versions of exploitation. There's also homegrown big tech. In India, it's called Reliance Jio. And it's so much harder actually to push back against that. So, you might get the bogeyman of Facebook's taking away all our data, oh, Cambridge Analytica, let's regulate Facebook. But what that happens is basically it creates a market in which the local players with much stronger political connections in the global South, much harder to disrupt by civil society is actually less able to fight them. It basically comes in and takes over the space. And that creates a whole other set of problems. Yeah, it's not a very optimistic answer, I'm sorry. But I do think that if we map it ecosystem-wise, it would be easier to understand what we need to go after.
Joanna, you had something you want to share?
Sure. Oh, we have successful examples in Latin America of working in coalitions. In Brazil, the civil society working on digital rights is very diverse, and we have many organizations, and we all work under one coalition. Not we all, but many of them working under one coalition that's called Coalizão Direitos na Rede. So operating like that, we can guarantee effective advocacy in the legislative in Brazil. And regionally, Coalition Rights is part of another coalition which is called Al-Sur, also of the digital rights organizations from Latin America. So like having a regional document opposition in a particular topic, it's very important for us to be able to bring to those big techs or to regional forums to put pressure in the US offices, for instance. And sometimes those coalitions coordinate with civil society from the US as well, because as Shamaya was saying, sometimes our countries are like the guinea pigs is where they test things, because the law regulation or enforcement is weaker, no? So we need to go and also have pressure like multi-country, in the multi-country level. So coalitions have been very important for winning some battles in the last years.
So we have a question from the audience building on this multi-country point, which is, how might the monetization and dehumanization process on surveillance capitalism be distinctive in Lagos compared to Beijing, compared to Silicon Valley? So I guess not thinking of big tech in the sort of universal way, but really thinking about contextualizing it in different contexts and societies and government structures and so on.
Well, I think it's always going to be different because of different cultures, different societies. The way that I think about it, when technology is built with a certain set of ethical considerations, and then it's deployed in other society which might not have the same ethical considerations or the same value systems rather, then there's a chance that there might be conflicts. So surveillance capitalism in that case may, or like its harmful effects rather, may show up differently in Lagos than they might do in Beijing. Something we didn't touch about as well is that there is also a cultural views on privacy, right? They might have like some similarities, but they might be also different, and especially in societies where the individual might be seen more as a communal being belonging to the community. So privacy might even be different there, and so because of that, surveillance capitalism might mean something different in Lagos than it means in Beijing or somewhere else, and one example that is similar to the incident in the genocide in Myanmar is a similar story in, I believe, in northern Nigeria, where Facebook was being used to sort of, communicate hate between two members of two different villages. And one of the issues there, is that and so, I mean, this is usually shared when talking about how to use the media to effectively talk about or to do journalism effectively in the African continent, is that the individual can be seen as a community itself. And so maybe a targeted insult or targeted action against an individual from another village or group might be seen as actually an attack from one village or a group to another group entirely. And so a particular incident in northern Nigeria, I believe, was this individual was sending hate messages and posting and so forth, and of course it was being spread and shared and amplified through the algorithms, and then so you end up seeing violence between these two villages and the killings that erupted because of that. And so that could be one manifestation of surveillance capital, say in Lagos, due to how maybe the interplay between the individual and the oneness between the individual and the community. But it could be something different in Hong Kong, something else different in Beijing. It just depends on the cultural and the value systems that exist.
I have that's super interesting, Sabelo. Thank you. So I have two examples of ways in which it might be different from a technological and a political point of view. So one is that most surveillance systems, we think of them almost as hoovering up data in the wild, but actually they're recording something into pre-created data sets. And so, Joanna, you had this beautiful presentation about gender and all its subtleties. And it reminded me of, I think it was a Data and Society paper in which they pointed out that if an algorithm chooses to record everyone as male or female, it erases all other gender identities. And so if you think of the global surveillance capitalist systems as systems that are absorbing data into their preconceived notion of how this data needs to be recorded, then it's going to societies that are as different as the societies in Beijing and Lagos, and recording them into its own understanding of what the baseline features of these societies are, which, as we know in human societies, is dramatically different. And so you might say also that its recording of the population is just, it's wrong. I discovered it in some ways in which, Google Maps, at least back in the day, I don't know if it still does this, it would show you traffic based on people's phones traveling in cars, right? And so you might go through Bangalore thinking that a particular street in Bangalore is just like, smooth sailing, and you go there and you find a bunch of like bullock carts and cycle rickshaws, because they would, at least at the time, they didn't have devices that showed up. And so that street is completely blocked, but Google Maps doesn't know because it only records a particular kind of data. And so, these systems get things dramatically wrong, even at a technological level. I think at a political level, since we're talking about the capitalists here, we'll call them informational capitalists because Sabelo correctly pointed out that they're about more than surveillance. When they go into countries that have systems that are still forming and that are a little weak and vulnerable to pressure, and this again, both my colleagues have pointed out in their presentations, they get to define what the data protection law is. They get to define how intermediary liability is treated. And so at a political level, they're able to access, and I don't want to use the word lobby because it's technically illegal in quite a lot of countries, but they are able to shape the legal systems that are then going to govern what they can and cannot do. And they do that extensively in the global south. So it's another thing to take into account.
Thank you. So, I'm reminded daily that we are in the midst of this pandemic. And so, as we think about the various kind of ways in which people can protect themselves and their family members and others, we've talked about masks and hand washing and kind of social distancing. And one thing, of course, that has come up, as people re-enter the workforce and society is the issue of contact tracing. And as we think about these different layers of technology that are already in place to surveil our every action and move, and now we think about the tracking of individuals who might have been exposed to COVID, what kinds of safeguards are needed to ensure both the right to health, but then also the right to privacy?
I think it's a very important topic. I think many researchers and organizations that are working on privacy, surveillance are very worried about the pandemic opening space for more and more surveillance and for techno-solutionisms, like contact tracing apps being abused by governments or those data leaking. And I see, I had to cross a border, and the amount of data that I had to give to be able to do so already increased a lot, and very, very personal data. And now I'm in Berlin now, and you need to put your name and telephone every restaurant you go in case someone. I was a bit shocked, and I was coming here from Brazil, which has a complete I don't know even how to compare, but it's how the government handled the pandemics was on more in the US style and denial, say just a little flu, but in the other hand, also hiding public information or being less transparent about that. So this how do we balance all this need? I think it's a big challenge, and we'll need to map everything very closely. What's going on? I also think it's problematic that most of the tracing apps that are being deployed are based on the Google, Apple API. So it's even crazy to think that even Europe couldn't come up with an API that would be so interoperable than Google and Apple could. So it shows a lot of the power of those companies, and we are giving away sensitive data about who you've been with. And yeah, I don't have an answer, but I have a lot of worries about this new scenario.
Sabelo?
Yes, thank you, Sushma. I think as we're around about COVID, its implications, and also how to stay safe and protected, I think there's still one slight danger that we're not really talking about the most in the general conversations that happen. And it sort of relates to using this moment as a way to try to plug in or to try to enforce a type of technology or a type of thinking. For example, we can imagine when the vaccines are being rolled out, as let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, there might be a danger that under the guise of how to efficiently distribute the vaccines, how to pass them to those who need it the most, we need a tracking system, right? We need a digital ID of some sort using biometric data, and we've seen examples like this happen with refugee communities, for example in Congo, where in order to receive aid, they were required to give up a lot of biometric information, and they refused, right? But the danger is that we might see a repeat of that happening again, but now, taking advantage of this deadly pandemic that we're in, but trying to use that as a way to still try to push one type of agenda or one type of, techno solutionism to marginalized populations.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting point in the vaccines, and there's actually been controversy in the US where a couple of historically Black colleges and university presidents had talked about having vaccine trials with students there. And then there was a lot of concerns that were raised given sort of the historical legacies with this. Chinmay, maybe one last point as we wrap up, because I know we're out of time, but perhaps a closing thought or reflection from you, either on the pandemic or related to what we've been talking about.
Thank you. I think that maybe techno-solutionism is the one that I'll pick up on, Sabelo. Thank you. I think that it's interesting to think of how we've used technology in the wake of this crisis. Who is being legible to whom? And I see this as I had to write about the Indian contact tracing app for the Council of Foreign Affairs blog, and I had to look at the various structures of different kinds of apps to evaluate it. And it's interesting because you could choose a model of a contact tracing app that acquires minimal information. The one feature of the Indian contact tracing app that was helpful was that people without smartphones could choose to call in. And there was a model that kind of helped them engage with it. But then having given the information, they were given no control really over how far it was shared. There was much more information than that was being collected than was necessary. And then it was a very top-down system of how this is going to be monitored, as opposed to different structures that are available where it's shared, the users are told that they've come into contact with someone and they're encouraged to isolate. So individuals have control. It's interesting. And then there's a second level to it, right? Which is that I know for a fact that because people have been reacting with fear and hate in India every time someone contracts a virus, now even doctors who know that someone is infected, they choose not to say that it's COVID. So they give them all the medication, they give them other reasons and encourage them to isolate, but they don't name it as this particular virus because of the way in which people are reacting. And so we're pretending that these apps are getting accurate data, and they're just really not. And then the third, which I've always been wondering, is why is the legibility so top down, right? Like, why is everyone being treated like they're criminals and they need to be herded and watched all of the time, as opposed to how come we don't have apps that are monitoring hospital beds and helping people access help when they need it, telling them where to get masks? It's interesting that the techno-solutionism hasn't really gone that way, which might have been a little more useful.
Thank you all for your very provocative and thoughtful remarks. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We're going to actually continue along these themes tomorrow. We'll be hearing from Safiya Noble from UCLA, who's the author of Algorithms of Oppression. So that's an event tomorrow afternoon. So thank you all for joining us.